Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So Charlie Kirk sat down with Governor Gavin Newsom recently, and it seemed like a very interesting conversation, considering how far on different sides of the spectrum they are. People are saying that Newsom is going to be a front runner for 2028, that he's going to run for the Democratic Party, and that he's smart enough to understand that if he's going to run, he's going to have to now run as a moderate. Because at some points during the podcast interview, there seemed to be some common ground that they reached, some agreement. Charlie Kirk, however, says he's not buying it. But Gavin Newsom is getting a lot of backlash for seeming to side with the right on certain issues. He's getting dragged by leftists, getting dragged by liberals, but he's also receiving some praise from moderates. And then there's the rest of us who just aren't buying it because we know that he wants to run. This guy is extremely manipulative. Some might even say narcissistic, although that word is thrown around a bit too much. So of course the topic of men competing in women's sports comes up. The topic of forcing girls to compete against boys comes up. And of course he wants to come across as somebody who has common sense. He wants to come across as somebody who is moderate, because he knows he needs the people who voted for Trump to vote for him if he's going to have a chance. And he's been criticized by the radical leftists, heavily criticized, and praised by the more moderate Democrats like Bill Maher. So unfortunately, Governor Newsom doesn't believe in fair use. So I had the clip ready to show you guys, and I got a copyright warning, so I cannot show any of the clip, not even a few seconds. So I'm going to read a transcript of what Gavin Newsom said. He basically said that he thinks it's unfair for boys to be competing against girls. He admitted that it's unfair and that he agrees that it's unfair. And that was it. He never said anything about ending it in California and doing anything about it, though. So this was for the first episode of his new podcast. This is Gavin Newsom. And one of the topics of discussion that came up was whether or not men should be in women's sports. And the governor gave a so-so answer. I think it's an issue of fairness. I completely agree with you on that. So that's easy to call out, the unfairness of that. And then this is the part where I think his manipulative, narcissistic tendencies crept in. And this is a very typical manipulative argument that's put out there that I consider to be emotional blackmail. There's also a humility and a grace. You know that these poor people are more likely to commit or to unalive themselves, have anxiety and depression. And the way that people talk down to vulnerable communities is an issue that I have had a hard time with as well. So both things I can hold in my hand. How we can address this issue with the kind of decency that I think, you know, it's inherent in you, speaking to Charlie, but not always expressed on the issue. At the same time, deal with the issue. So Charlie actually said, why don't you call out these trans athletes? This situation that has been created. We have a long jumper, for example, about to win a women's competition in track and field. A.B. Hernandez, I believe Charlie mentioned this person. And he challenged Newsom to call this out, to say that I think this is wrong. And what he did say was that he believes it's unfair. But of course, he is the governor of California, and we know where California stands. So he had to throw that in there. The argument that has been the basis of the trans movement. If you don't capitulate to these demands, there are going to be people unaliving themselves. The whole basis of this movement is based on that lie, is based on that statement that has no basis in fact, no basis in evidence, no basis in studies that show that if boys aren't allowed to compete against girls in sports, that they're going to take their lives. Because before this was happening, there weren't an overwhelming number of men taking their lives because they weren't allowed to compete in women's sports. The same thing goes for surgeries and medications and all of that. In fact, there's studies saying the opposite now, that there's no evidence whatsoever that this prevents or reduces the rate at which they unalive themselves. And when it comes to the surgery, they're now finding evidence that it's more likely to be the opposite. That once they've had their bodies mutilated, once they've been physically or chemically castrated, That's when they wake up one day, turn around and look at what has been done to them. And then they start getting thoughts of that nature. So he's throwing out these statements as if they're statements of fact, and they're simply not. And he knows exactly what he's doing. And if anything, it's the girls who suffer. It's the girls who suffer the most. Dealing with a situation that they were thrown into, they didn't ask for, they didn't consent to, not to mention the backlash they receive, the threats they receive. How do you think that's going to affect their mental health? Competing against somebody who has an unfair advantage over them on the basis of biology. How do you think that affects their mental health? Losing state championships. One sprinter lost 4 state championships. 4 to a male athlete. She said applying for scholarships, applying for schools. There's a big difference when you apply as somebody who came second and when you apply as somebody who won 4 state championships. A big difference. Till this day, she doesn't know how it affected her career. These young female athletes are involved in court cases that last for years. How do you think that affects their mental health? Getting injured, having your career ruined because of injury, taking you out of the game permanently, dealing with partial paralysis, brain damage, a broken knee. How do you think that affects a young female athlete's mental health? No mention of that though, of course. Having trans activists call your workplace and try and get you fired or succeed in getting you fired. How do you think that affects a female's mental health? You only care about the entitled male athletes who wants to infringe upon women's sports, who want to compete in the wrong categories. Athletes that actually have options. Male athletes can compete against other male athletes. It's very simple. They have options. The women don't.
Obviously is going to try to change, but he is like a reptile, right? And so he's just constantly like a chameleon. Okay, what do you want me to be this week? But he has a Kamala Harris problem. All of his positions are well known. And this is a guy who he attacked people who were trying to protect women in sports. He opened civil rights investigations into school boards and districts that passed parental notification laws preventing schools from hiding info from parents about their own kids. And maybe he'll disavow that now too, but I'm going to go on the record and say I do not believe, for as nice a guy as he might be, and for as funny he might be, and Jesse might really like him, I've never had a chance to meet him. I'm sure we would get along great. I just do not think he will be the nominee for the Democrats in 2028.
Greg, give us your opinion.
Well, here's the deal. I think that Gavin Newsom realizes that the party's in trouble, and he realizes that it's cleaving. You have the Bill Maher Democrat and the Joy Reid Democrat. They can no longer coexist, which is why he made this podcast play, and it feels like Club Random. He is trying to keep the men from completely disowning the party. Mm-hmm. You know, and he can't just say, hey, I'm different. He's got to show his evolution on the podcast. So he's bringing in all these conservatives to show that he's not like a 3-eyed, 10-legged freak that you normally, assume is a Democrat. Part of me now about his trans shift. Part of me says, better late than never. Like what Harold's saying, don't argue with someone who is agreeing with you. He's finally agreeing with me, except he's still lying.
Right.
He said that the trans are a group prone to suicide because people don't accept them. There is absolutely no data on that. And it's a dangerous fact. In fact, the data shows dramatic increases in depression post-trans surgery. Why is that not surprising? Well, imagine all the attention you get, and it turns out, before you get the transition, and it turns out you regret it, all that attention goes away. So you become deeply, deeply depressed. Ask a detransitioner. So what's crazy about this and what's so wrong about what he said is remember the story you were told. Doctors pressuring parents into surgery for their kids by asking this one question: would you rather have a dead son or a living daughter? That was a criminal question, a criminal lie. Every doctor who asked that question should be disbarred and perhaps charged with something, because that's the same lie that Gavin is pushing. These kids are really, really depressed. No, they're not. You totally effed up their heads with this delusion.
So Bill Maher said, I do love this because I do think he's a great politician. I know he's slick. Yeah, they said the same thing about Clinton. He's a great politician. He's really smart. You can talk great. Chicks dig them. And I've always been saying, if you would just tack to the center, well, it happened this week. So I agree with Greg Gutfield right there. I'm not buying it. He's not moving to the center. He's moving to a place where he can get more votes when it comes down to it, when it comes down to his eventual election campaign bid. And that's what this is about. Typical politician. They will say what needs to be said to get the votes, but when it comes down to it, when it comes to their policies, we will see a completely different thing entirely. And that's what we're seeing right now anyway, because he is the governor of California. And California are not banning male athletes from women's competitions, from girls' sports. They're continuing to perpetuate this injustice against women and defying federal law. But of course, we had the Democrats who are fuming, absolutely fuming over that podcast interview because Newsom gave the very appearance of siding with conservatives or Republicans on this issue. Assemblyman Chris Ward said, sometimes Gavin Newsom goes for the profile, encourage, sometimes not. This is a trans or LGBTQ activist. And President Kelly Robinson, he told the Daily News, when the LGBTQ plus lives are under attack, real leaders don't hedge, they fight. Across the country, extremists are stripping away rights, banning books and targeting trans kids just for being who they are. This is not the time for political calculations of playing it safe. It's time to be bold, to stand up and to say unequivocally, we will protect LGBTQ plus people with everything we've got. There were kids waking up today in California with the news, thinking that their governor hates them, and rightly so, Lori Lightfoot said. We know all about her.
What did you make of what Governor Newsom had to say?
Well, I think I made of it what most people will make of it, which is he read I mean, he pretty much said it. He was impressed by how they weaponized the issue. Here's my advice. If I were giving the governor advice, I'd say, don't be so overt that people can see the wheels turning. The obvious question would be, well, you've been governor of California for 6 years. You were lieutenant governor for many years before that. When did you have this epiphany? Right. And the answer is when he found that the Republicans could weaponize the issue.
The thing that bothered me about the whole incident was it was such an obvious gimmick. Right. He needed some headlines to say, Newsom breaks with the left. Right. And what does he do? He picks of all the people that you could pick to try to say, hey, I want to talk to somebody who's coming from a different perspective than me. It was such a gimmick. And to David's point, it's like the thirstiness is dripping off of him. And it's like, just stop it. It's gross. And, he's using the left, basically. And these are the people who have had his back for a very long time, when they tried to recall him, actually. And I just don't think people are not going to take too kindly to it.
I think Charlie Kirk did a very good job. And I think it was nice that we can sit down with the opposition, so to speak, and have a conversation. But when it comes to people like Newsom, when it comes to politicians like him, we know that they will say what needs to be said. He has the gift of the gab. There's no denying that. And that's what we saw on display, and that's all it is. It's all talk. So let me know what you think. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, and God willing, I will see you in the next video.